I think it's recording. That's good. And welcome back to another video with me, JD. You're joining me for a very special preseason video today because joining me is the great Jaiden Popowski, who you probably know off Twitter, where you can find him. What is your handle there, Jaiden Popowski, on Twitter as well? _Popowski. Yep.
Yeah.
And he's also recently released his Stats by Jaiden website, which has a lot of the research he's been doing over this preseason ready for you to access. And there's so much good stuff in there. Fantasy, Supercoach, what players need to average to be worthwhile, information on stoppages, clearances, all that type of stuff. How Supercoach is scored, cracked the holy grail of data. So today what we're going to do is go through Jaiden's basically top 5 insights from the preseason, actually going through all this data, all this information, distilling it into something we can use. What are the things that are going to change how he thinks about building his fantasy or Supercoach sides this year, and how it changes how he assesses players too. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jaiden, to say hi.
Great. Thanks, JD. And it's great to be here and, finally get a chance to chat through the stuff we've been doing. Essentially, where I come from, it's like I've played fantasy for a long time. I've played Supercoach a little bit, never really taken it massively seriously. And I guess I'm a little bit frustrated with the amount of data that's available, the amount of analysis that's available, and that's in my skill set. So I really want to try and come up with some maybe more advanced things that will help my own team, and sharing that around is pretty good because it helps other people as well. But at the heart of it, I'm trying to research stuff for my own team, and that's why I've had to come up with these kind of new things that will help inform me and educate me about the different games and what's going on from a data point of view, so that the analysis can actually be proper and advanced, and not just haphazard, people picking little stats from everywhere. I really want the full set so I understand what's going on. So I guess the first thing that I did, that's kind of my biggest project I think I've ever done. It was a very long off-season project. So essentially, I asked the question of how is Supercoach scored, and there is a little bit of it was a fair bit of research to kind of get enough information to understand what to do. So I guess when it comes down to it, we're looking at what players do with the ball, how they dispose of it, and where on the ground it is. So I did a bit of research and I figured out that D50, forward 50 stats get a bit of a boost. And I've never really seen that before. So I guess for me, I needed to have stats that were broken down into zone. So I got a bunch of new data. And essentially what I did was just create all the stats I possibly could, whether that was calculating the kick distances. It was all very manual to figure out what had happened in the game. But essentially, now I have a full set of statistics, and I plug that into the Supercoach final score, and everything gets calibrated with each other. And this is what came out. I've got the full list of what the stats are worth. And yeah, it was a massive project, but I'm so happy with the results. I did a similar thing last year where I kind of used what the Supercoach game tells us things are worth, and it wasn't as accurate as this. So this is 97% explains the variation of Supercoach, which I'm really happy with.
Yeah, that's awesome. And look, firstly, it's great to have people like you in the community, Jaiden, because I love data and stats, and I'd love to base more of my decisions off that. I can use information once it's there, but I definitely don't have the skills that you do to actually put it out there into the world. So you're a huge help to the community, and you probably know how much I value that just because of how annoying I am pinging you with questions every other day. Have you looked at this? Have you thought about that? Oh no, not another JD ping. This is really awesome work. So trying to go to that next level of actually explaining how Supercoach works, which has always been a frustration for Supercoach players, is that we get given these kind of rough guides by Herald Sun or the Supercoach game each year on what each stat is worth. But it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't adequately explain some of the reasons why things are worth more or less than others. And it doesn't go into enough detail on, for example, kicks. There are different type of kicks. So it's not just about the zone, but what type of kick it is as well. And so with your work, you've been able to explain 97% of scores. I assume the last little bit is due to scaling or potentially, something else like that. But the way I kind of interpret this is, for a given stat, this is the average amount of points you'll get for it. And there might be some deviation on that based on, context in the game or what happens next.
Yeah, exactly right. And I guess that brings me to my second learning. And that is the fact that the official values that we get provided by the game and by other things on social media, like, they just aren't really helpful at all. And that's what I was frustrated with, because I did something similar last year. I had player scores about 30 points too high and they needed to all be scaled back. Just none of these stats are really worth that much due to the overall match scaling bringing it down. So, I guess something I learnt quite a bit was just the fact that the stuff you see, even from official sources, they might not really know what's going on with the scoring, and the values are pretty far off, or not that far off, but I would say the average stat is worth a lot less than what they say it is. So there's not much use in saying a kick is worth 4 if you add up all the kicks and then there's 5,000 points in a game. That makes no sense because there's only 3,300. So the average kick is only worth about 3 or something. So it's little things like that that give you a bit better of an insight into the game. And I find that it's really frustrating when you look at official kind of sources, because these are the educators for the game. They can teach the community how to play. And like, it's kind of a little bit frustrating to do something like this and find that there's so many differences, so many distinctions, and knowing that it's 97% accurate with a little bit of offset. So like, the most off score was Sam Walsh last year when he played West Coast. The first half he dominated. Carlton blew West Coast out of the water. So he gets a good boost for, being good when the game was closer, and then it blew out. But then he got injured at halftime, so he didn't do anything after halftime. So it's things like that where the little errors come in, but it's just not useful to understand. If you see an effective handball, that's just 1 point. So things like that, like, you have a way better calibration in your own mind of what things are worth and how to compare different things when it comes to different players.
Yeah, so just to touch on this then, I think what might be useful is to go through what are the stats that you kind of didn't expect to get points, or you expected to get a lot of points that, had the vice versa. Or alternatively, what are those types of stats that have previously been published that were just really far off? So I think that'd be a really good place to touch on. And then maybe we'll go into some of the differences between D50, forward 50 and that in the middle.
Yeah, so I guess when it came to figuring out what stats are included, I did use the official sources to get an idea of maybe the stats that are included, but I didn't care about the values because I could find those later.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the biggest one that I learnt was probably the kick-in ones, because I don't think there's been much about that in the past. But like, you want to play on, get a little 0.25 bonus, and then your disposal gets marked normally. That was pretty interesting. And I suppose just better breaking it down. So like, often we see these stats compiled that aren't actually that discrete as what they need to be. So take something like contested possessions, for example. We know that Supercoach players need to be good contested wise, like Lockie Neal there, because they actually get rewarded for that, unlike the fantasy game. So you get rewarded for possession. But the problem is, if we know that a contested possession, everyone says it's worth 4.5, there's actually 5 or 6 different types of contested possessions. So there's ground ball gets like loose. There's ground ball gets when it comes down from a marking contest. And there's free kicks that are counted as contested possessions. There's also contested marks. There's just a bunch of different ones. Grabbing it out of the ruck. Like, there's all these little ones that make up a stat. And I think that's the biggest thing I learned. And that's probably the hardest thing, to calibrate everything to the stat totals that I know. But they don't go into this level of detail when they talk about what things are worth. And often it can vary quite a lot between the two different things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think what is useful in the work that you've done as well is start to explain how players score differently. So I'll bring up one of your tweets here, which looks at the Supercoach average of the top mids last year and where the differences in where their scorings come from. So this starts to then aggregate up again. And I think one of the things that stands out here is Bontempelli on the top with those 1%ers. And that's what people always seem to complain about, that he has this magical scaling that goes on. But I think it's because of some of these stats that you're talking about here, like the contested knock-ons, which actually score very highly, but aren't really listed anywhere externally of to their value or exactly how valuable they can be.
Yeah, exactly right. So that's a great example because of these contested knock-ons being worth 4 or more points, depending on where it is. But then other contested possessions like free kicks 4, they're only worth 1. So like it's very important that you understand the different distinctions that are actually going on in the game, so that when you look at stats that are easily available, say on the AFL website, if you look at the clanger stat, you need to know that there's potentially 6 or 7 stats that have been added up to cause that clanger stat. That's not just kick clangers. So there's so many different ones in there that could be dropping a mark, and things like that. So there's a great distinction. And yeah, this was fascinating to me. I guess Bontempelli is like 10 points better than the next best midfielders in Supercoach. But in fantasy, he's a fair bit closer to what he normally is. So I don't think it's from his disposal or his marks or his tackles or his goal kicking. It must be from something else. So what I did with this was just aggregate all the stats for each kind of category that I had on the website, and see where players get that point. So Nick Dacos is the best out of those for disposal, which is pretty obvious. He's an outside type player, less on possessions and marks. And someone like Rory Laird, really good with the tackles. Petrarca is more forward, so he gets the scoring. But the reason why Bontempelli is so much better than everyone else, despite being kind of similar in disposal, similar in marks, is those 1%ers. So that's where he's pretty much gets those stats from that people don't understand. And they'll think, how did Bontempelli score the most in this game when in fantasy he wasn't actually that high? So it's these little things. It's really important to understand that the game is very complicated, but if you understand it, it's actually fairly simple.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you say fairly simple. Not all of us have models to run off the back end that would make it maybe a little bit simpler. Maybe that's the next big project, like a fan footy variation that actually like has all the detailed stats plugged into it as the game goes on for more accurate estimation. That's a ridiculous idea, by the way. Please don't spend your time on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the interesting thing there is obviously that the values that we get told about probably aren't real, and going and checking your site, at least making familiar with what are the different types of ways to score and the points that are added to them is definitely valuable. And then the one thing I wanted to touch on, which to me I didn't know, this was actually brand new to me, and I think it'll be brand new to many others as well, is that possessions, or like the same stat in defensive or forward 50, is worth roughly 20% more than when it's done around the ground. So like, can you delve into any insight onto what's going on there? Because I think it starts to explain why players like Sinclair and Short, who had really nice halfback roles, got moved into the midfield, maybe did a little bit better with some of their stats, but their scoring either plateaued or went backwards.
Yeah, exactly right. So when I was doing my research about the Supercoach game, I had a bunch of ideas in my head. I was reading lots of different sources, and I found that there was evidence that defensive 50 and forward 50 stats do get a bit more of a boost, maybe a little bit of a multiplier on them because they're in the scoring zones. And I find that absolutely intriguing because it really meant that I had to do a lot more data work to break down every single stat in D50, the mid zone, or the forward 50. And like, I'm really pleased with how the results came out because it is actually fairly like that 20%, that 20% bonus. So it was massively worth my time to break that down. And that's why I was much more accurate with my results than ever before. But yeah, this is a great example. Jack Sinclair last year, he averaged 111 when he was playing in defense using a CBA split, and 94 as a mid. But if you look at his stat differences there. He got more tackles in the mid, so he's getting 3 points per game more as a midfielder, which makes sense. He's tackling in the mids, he's kicking long from the mids. But the drop-off is really from the kicking in D50. So there's a bunch of D50 stats there that have dropped off. And that's where most of the drop-off came from, because he's not getting that bonus of kicks being worth more in D50 compared to mid. So if you look at the effective kicks that are long, he's scoring more as a mid, 2.2, but then the D50 drop-off is 5.1, even though his numbers might actually be the same amount of kicks, but he doesn't get that bonus in defense. So that's why he's got this massive split between defender and mid-time, because he doesn't get those bonus points in defense. So it's really important to understand with players like Jaiden Young coming up this year, whether his tackling and his midfield stats can actually outweigh what he used to do in defense with these this kind of added bonus from being in D50 most of the time.
That's, I think, a good transition, because I'm not sure if it was in one of your top 5 points, but I definitely wanted to ask about some of your work that you've done looking into scoring, basically in transition versus stoppage, and some of the work you've done there. And there's a really cool chart that you produced as well, which looks at this, like basically what players can score in different roles. And what I'd love to do is, firstly, give it a little bit of an explainer to what's going on here for those that haven't seen it before. But secondly, between, the scoring stuff we've talked about and these types of transition charts, how is it changing which players you are and aren't considering? Where would you use this? How are you informing your team selections based on this work?
Yeah, exactly. It kind of comes back to the fact that when I've been playing fantasy and Supercoach, I'm looking at the stats that are available. So the most popular one in the community is centre bounce attendances, which is fine. They're fine, but just because they're the best we have doesn't actually mean they're really good. So I think the community really needs to understand that there can be better stats in future. Yep. You don't have to always think about centre bounces. And something that frustrates me about them is the fact that you can have two players with the same usage. One of them is in there to score and one of them's not. So how can I actually break that down? I came up with a way to split up player points by whether they were from a stoppage situation, which is what we want our midfielders to be doing, or in a transition situation on the outside when the ball's in D50 and they transition up the field. So we've got these two different splits. In terms of this chart here, what I did was correlate their centre bounces with their stoppage points and their transition points. So if you look in the top left of this chart, that is where players... So someone like Josh Rochelle, when he gets CBAs, his stoppage scoring goes up, which is expected, but his transition scoring also goes up, so it helps him to get involved around the ground. So he needs CBAs if he wants to score. If we look at the players in the top right, which are a bit more common because it makes sense, when they get CBAs, they score from stoppages, like Jaiden Young. He gets those tackles, but his transition points drops off, which makes sense because he's scoring around the midfield. He's not as involved in defense. So he's got that dual position kind of ability to be able to score as a defender or as a midfielder, which is really exciting for his prospects coming up. Compared to someone like Rochelle, his role is so important because he can't score without it. So that's kind of where that sits.
Yeah, so it's interesting because for me, I like the way I kind of interpret this is I see some of these names in here like Doherty, Sinclair, Dawson, Short, and these are all examples of guys that have done well in both defensive roles and then also midfield roles. And so I look at someone like Jaiden Young and Winhager, who are both examples of this. Sheasel, another example as well, of maybe their upside is somewhat limited by getting more midfield time. Maybe that doesn't actually help them that much. Whereas, for this top left segment, to me, it says these guys need to be getting more CVAs for them to actually have an increase in scoring potential this year. Or improvement can come from other ways. But in terms of clearest line to improvement, that would be the way to go about it. The one thing I think will be interesting, seeing this over time, is how players change over time. So, for example, I could see like Connor McDonald not being where he is in like a couple of years' time if he was to progress into more of a midfield role. I wonder what happens with Errol over time as well. So yeah, lots to take out of this one.
Yeah, and essentially with McDonald, he just hasn't had enough midfield time to have that midfield impact yet. So that's why he's down on the stoppage points when he does get CBAs. But yeah, I guess the main point of this, it isn't really to do with whether they can score big and score well in what they want, but it's more to do with whether players have the ability to adjust how they score their points, whether they can actually be flexible and have multiple ways to score, because roles can change week to week. You don't always know whether the coach is going to move them in places. But with players like Jaiden Young, you can be really confident that he has the ability to score as a midfielder in stoppages and also as a defender in transition. And
interesting.
Yeah,
so you read this as more like a resiliency to role changes rather than like breakout potential, scoring potential.
Yeah, so it's kind of on an individual player level. Like, it's not really comparing player to player, but it's more on an individual level, whether they have the ability to adjust how they're scoring based on their role. So people like Rochelle and Caldwell, they want to be midfielders and they can't really score if they're not. But these other players like Jack Sinclair, we know he's good as a defender and he's good as a mid because he's got that good baseline in general. His role doesn't actually really matter too much because he just changes how he's scoring. For someone like Jack McRae, who's right in the middle of the 0-0, there's no correlation at all between his role and what he's actually doing. So that's really intriguing to me.
Oh, that tends to suggest that his drop-off has been entirely due to like age and where he's at rather than anything else.
Yeah, definitely. And it wasn't a very popular opinion at the time, but I think people have come around to it now that he's gotten injured. Maybe people have come around to it more. But yeah, he used to score massively well without centre bounces, and now he doesn't have them again, and he's not doing as well. So I don't know.
So that's the type of play that I'm guessing from this analysis that you'd say, well, like I believe that his decline has just been due to him rather than because of anything Bevo's doing. That's unlikely to reverse as he gets older. Type of player I'd probably fade rather than start.
Yeah, for me, that's where I see it at the moment. I know he's a little bit in the centre bounce reliance category here, but if you actually look at his last 3 seasons, so he had a massive year in 2021 and he's slowly dropped off since. If you compare those, he's like sitting exactly at 0-0. So even when he was playing midfield, his scoring was just so random. Like there's no role correlation at all. So I'm a little bit hesitant to start him. But to be honest, I'm not sure if the midfield time is going to be massive anyway. So he could be fine.
Now, this was just for calibration. This is looking at fantasy. Is that right? The transition stoppage points is on. Yep. And then because I think the other one that's interesting here is Taylor Adams, who's definitely a more popular pick in fantasy. People look him at Supercoach as well, just given his price. But yeah, another one that's down in the bottom category. So are you cooler on someone like Adams because of this type of analysis, or do you think that it may not hold when a player changes teams?
I haven't exactly looked into his form over the last 3 years because this is only from 2023, but he's a little bit further into that centre bounce reliance category. So I'm a bit more confident in him. And I think like as a Pies fan, he didn't really get used in there that much. So he probably doesn't have that same extreme change that someone like McRae does. So Adams was maybe a bit more consistent with his centre bounces. But then someone like Jaiden Young was so far away from the middle. That's because he had that variation. He had massive CBA games and he had no CBA games. He just had that variation.
Awesome. Okay, so where to next from here?
I think we've talked about a few of the points. I guess let's go for talking about the stoppage points. In AFL fantasy and I guess the best players in the competition. So we always talk about when a player wins a Brownlow, they're going to regress a bit. They're not going to be able to go as well. And that makes sense because if you win a Brownlow, it's probably your career best year. So for these players, if I look at the best stoppage points performers, last year it was Marcus Bontempelli in AFL fantasy. He scored, I think, like 63 points from stoppages. That is a massive number. And if I look at the last kind of 2 years of what's happened to these high stoppage players, the top 15 stoppage points players from each year, only 2 of them managed to improve at stoppage next year. So 13 of them are dropping off, and that correlates with a fantasy drop-off as well. So you can't really expect these high stoppage reliant players to continue to smash out the stoppage points reliably. They might need to maybe transition to the outside bit and score a bit more there. I know if you type in the top in that search box, if you type in mid, then it will only bring up the midfielders.
Well, that's a hot tip. All right, excellent.
So
we just by stoppages. So basically, how high does this number need to be for you to kind of think regression might be on the way for these stoppage players?
So wrote a piece on Caleb Sarong the other day. You can see he's 4th there. In terms of the last 2 years, if players have gone 55 stoppage points or more, only one of them's managed to improve the next year. So that's out of 18.
In stoppage points or in total points?
In fantasy, because they can't keep up this high reliance on stoppages. Not so much that Bontempelli has to score only from stoppages compared to someone like Matt Rao, who plays pure inside. There's no outside at all. But there's players that are going over 55 from stoppages. That's not really sustainable. And only 1 out of 18 over the last 2 years have managed to improve their fantasy average from a 55 plus stoppage average. So that's just natural regression from having a massive year, pretty much probably their career best year, especially like people like Sarong and Taranto. They don't really get as much outside ball, so they are very reliant on the inside, and that can change dramatically each year. So I guess when it comes to this, you don't really want to be picking these premium mids that are so high in stoppage points, because they naturally decline in that a little bit without really being able to do anything about that. You want to be looking more in the range of like 51 stoppage points and below, down to about 38. So I did a piece the other day about breaking out. If you look at Bontempelli last year, he averaged just over 50 points from stoppages in the previous year, and he bumped that up like to 60 something. So exactly right here. So you can see Bont on the left-hand side in 2022, he did 50 points from stoppages. That's not too high. That's right at the top of the range of where you want to be. And he went full midfield, went absolutely crazy, and he improved 14.4 points per game. So these players here, they have between 38 and 51 stoppage points, and you can see the results. So there's plenty of green, plenty of improvement. Only 3 of these players went backwards out of 24. And essentially, that's the zone where players who end up being a top 8 mid will come from.
Yep. And I think for those that play Supercoach, like, this is worthwhile looking at too, because the correlation of who broke out here and improved is very high with Supercoach as well. So Bontempelli obviously was M1 for Supercoach as well last year. LDU had a breakout year. Taranto was a good pick. Sarong was a good pick. Rosie was a good pick. So there's a lot of overlap here. And this seems like it is a pretty good predictor, at least, of creating one short list of which mids should improve right year in the right scenarios. And I think looking at your score sources here, I think the other thing is I can quickly put a narrative around why a lot of these guys would go backwards. So Dogs and Crows were 2 of the highest stoppage teams last year. Are they likely to be the 2 highest stoppage teams again? Possibly, but are they likely to increase their stoppages even more? Like, I'd say unlikely. Someone like Sarong has now got other people with Fife and Young coming into the midfield. Will he continue to be as stoppage dominant as what he is? Taranto had Hopper missing for a lot of the year. So you can quite quickly see how these performances could just be one-off, because they had to kind of everything go right. You change any of that formula, the team goes backwards a little bit, other players come in and they fall away from these heights. And I think then what you're kind of showing us on the other side is that for some of these other guys, which are lower on stoppage points, you only need a few things to go right and you can have these really big breakouts. So they do get that bump in CVAs. The team has more stoppages. Another player in the side gets injured and all of a sudden you can go from this kind of sub 51 stoppage point range up to the 60s and really get a nice boost across both formats.
Yeah, we're ultimately looking for value here when it comes to our premiums. For our starting teams, like, we're looking for these players that still have room to improve, even if they're like a very good player already, a lot of these players still have room to improve from a stoppage point of view. And if they can get high usage and that team can kind of go right. So you can see in terms of the players on the right here that are in that zone for 2023, there's plenty from the same team. So Will Day, John Newcomb and James Warple, all from Hawthorn. There's room for one of them to be dominant, if that makes sense. So I know last year the Bulldogs didn't really have anyone. They all went around 50. They went 50 in 2022, and then both last year, Bont and Libba improved from this range. Libba's a bit too old to be included on this list, but they improved from this range and absolutely dominated. Like, they were the top of that team. So, and Walsh and Chera, Anderson and Miller, there's lots from the same team. So if you can pick the right one of them could easily be a top 8 mid without having to change too much. They just need to be a bit better at stoppages.
So I guess follow-up question then, how do you pick the right one from the team, or is it okay to pick multiple? Because, for example, last year, Butters and Rosie both, met the criteria here and both got enough points to be worthwhile selecting. So, does it give you confidence that maybe you could pick two from the same team, or how are you thinking about using this?
Yeah, a lot of them are mids this year. There was a few forwards in other years. So I probably wouldn't be picking two of the same type of player from the same team in your midfield because they do need that bit more of worthwhile. Like, they don't get the position adjustment from having forward status or anything like that. So they need a bit more to be worthwhile in the midfield. I guess in terms of this, you kind of want to be creating that narrative like you talked about with each of these players. So even for Christian Petrarca, he's in a massively similar range to what Bontempelli was last year. And they, you might think, okay, Petrarca averaged 104.7. I don't think you can really go bigger than that, can he? Bontempelli was 102, and they were the same age and had a similar stoppage transition split. But the thing for Petrarca, his transition scoring is really good already. Can he bump up that stoppages with less names in the Melbourne midfield this year? And he could easily be the number one scorer. So it's little things like that. Like, if I did this analysis last year, Bontempelli would have been right there, and he would have been the top of the tree. Like, people would have been pretty keen on him, I reckon. So it's just looking around the narrative to what's going on. And even Zach Merritt on that list last year, I know 107.2 is a massive average, but he averaged that without going massive at stoppages. So when Essendon kind of improved in stoppages a little bit towards the second half of the year, he was really able to take off. And because these players don't rely so heavily on stoppages, midfield is where the game is won. If you have a massively dominant year, opposition are going to want to try to shut you down. You're probably going to need some help. Everything can regress from there. So you want to be looking for the next kind of group to bring it up.
Yeah, cool. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, and I think the way I'm starting to look at this is it maybe confirms some of the players that I was putting in that were cheaper anyway, but as you mentioned, you still have to combine it with a narrative. So, for example, for Petrarca, I don't really see him getting more CBAs this year, because even when Oliver was out, they still didn't throw him. They wanted to use him forward. They're trying to cover their forward weakness more than the midfield weakness. So I'd have to see a lot of extra Petrarca midfield time for me to believe that his stoppage points are going to dramatically increase this year. He's good enough player, but I just don't think the role is going to be there. So it's probably someone I'm less keen on. But someone like, I don't know, maybe a Butters who started slower last year, just being a little bit fitter and not having an injury stuff, could he improve those numbers a bit more, especially around the ball where he might have been a little bit more protective? Like, I could see that being true. So yeah, I think that's where this becomes a really good sense check for what story you're weaving around why a player would improve, and then does it actually make sense once you see the data of how they performed last year?
Yeah, exactly. I think the Port Adelaide ones being in there again is pretty much also to do with that game style. They dropped off massively in points scored. And if they can just bump that up a little bit, then these two can very easily, bump up to that next level. So it is pretty exciting for some of those players. And like you said, the community is pretty switched on. So they understand the players that could go the next level, a bit underpriced. But this is kind of just reiterating that, and you can look at the past years to be like, okay, this is what happened to that player, and I can see it happening again.
Yeah, cool. That's awesome. Yeah, it's a really helpful way to actually put numbers around some of those breakout candidates and get a little bit more conviction on some of them being correct. I guess just one question with that. So it almost feels like some of the assumption there is that the transition points stay similar year on year. Has that been the case? Like, have you looked over multiple years and go, do you know what, transition players, like, I don't know, Brayshaw, I think, was up in the mid-50s or something like that. Like, has that always been the case for Brayshaw, and it's just that the stoppage numbers come up? Or, like, how do we think about that?
Yeah, in terms of Brayshaw himself, so he was on that list for 2021, and he did like 60-something points from transition, which is very high for a mid. I think he was mid-forward in 2020 in the fantasy games. So that could explain why he might have been having a bit more time out of the mids. But for him, he just improved his stoppage points because he was in that sweet spot. He could improve those stoppage points and pretty much be a massive scorer in fantasy because he had that room to grow, and the stoppage points went up and the transition points stayed the same. And I think a lot of people always want to ask me about the transition and the stoppage scoring. And it brings me to another point, another learning from the preseason. And that is when you look at center bounce usage and transition scoring, you might think, all right, if a player's getting more midfield time, they're going to get more involved around the ground. They're going to be, working around. They're going to be scoring more. And I honestly thought that as well. So I plugged it in, and it comes out that there's zero correlation, like pretty much as close to zero as you can possibly get. So essentially what that means is transition scoring is not related to center bounces. Transition scoring is more about the type of player they are and whether they have the ability to get around the ground. And that's actually really exciting because you can pretty much say that a player will maintain their transition scoring just based on their running ability, how hard they work around the ground, things like that. So I guess there's a few examples of this happening. With someone like Jack McRae, the community are very easy to look at the center bounces, which I do get frustrated at, but they say, okay, he had his biggest usage ever in 2021 and he's slowly dropped off since. So that correlates with his scoring going down, right? Mm-hmm. But that's only half the problem. Half the problem is the stoppage scoring from that center bounce role, but half the problem is from transition as well. So he's dropping off in that when there's no correlation at all between a player's role with center bounces and what they can score on the outside. So I think that's a really interesting thing that I learned, because it means we can kind of just look at these stoppage points instead of looking at center bounces, because they're a lot more, I guess, distinct in how they measure whether a player can score in that facet. And then we don't have to worry about the transition because they stay pretty consistent regardless of the role.
Okay, that's really useful. The last thing that I kind of wanted to ask about, and then happy to hand it over to you for any other insights or knowledge bombs you've got for us, is one of the things that you've got on your very handy website, which is once again this statsbyjaiden.com.au, is going into not only the possession points that we've talked about there from a Supercoach perspective, but then some of the other categories that you've grouped up. And you've got like basically a leaderboard for who scored most on these. We've spoken about stoppage point regression, but have you had a chance to look at, do you see the same regression in other categories, or do you expect them to be more consistent year on year? So for example, I can see Sicily is quite high on like disposal points, marking points. Are these the type of things that regress, or is that something we can expect to be more consistent year on year?
Yeah, so I haven't massively dove into the regression and breakout from the Supercoach breakdowns, because I'm more interested in just getting the data up onto my website. So this is, I guess, kind of the first look at it. And the reason I kind of did this top 10 is, I guess, for that purpose. You can look at it and be like, I don't think this player can maintain being the best in the comp at each category. And you've got to remember that Supercoach scoring is correlated with winning. So if Tom Green is tearing you up at possession every week, you're going to want to try and stop him. So there will be that natural regression for the top players in these categories to kind of come back. And Taylor Walker is a great example, just because he's getting older, and he had a massive year last year in front of goal. He was a lot more accurate than what was expected from where he was kicking from. So that natural regression can just come from the fact that he had a career best year, came second in the Coleman, things like that. So I guess that is the point of me putting up these like leaderboard things. So I can understand the players that are very reliant on one source of scoring and how quickly that can be shut down if they have a bad matchup or things like that.
Yeah, and I wonder as well, like on the clanger side, which is obviously a really big element of Supercoach, but not at all for fantasy, whether we can start to see positive regression for players in that regard. So, Taranto leading it, Tom Green right up there as well. Errol Goulden is not someone that I would have traditionally associated with a high clanger rate. Even Sicily, who's a good user of the ball. So whether these stats are consistent year on year or whether we see positive regression will be an interesting one for us to figure out as the years go on as well.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to clangers as well, you've got to remember with this leaderboard, like the more possessions you get, the more likely you are to have clangers. So that's very true for Taranto and Tom Green. I think with Errol Goulden, like he does very good kicks, but overall his kick rating based on where he takes his kicks isn't actually above average. And I can thank my friend on Twitter, Crow Data Site, for that data. Basically, his kicking is really good if it's really good, but then like he might not hit the same kicks that other people hit. So I guess he's a great offensive weapon if you get him in the right spots. But I think the reason why he's there is the fact that he was so good last year and he had so many possessions, so many things. And you've got to remember the clangers include disposal clangers, handball clangers, drop marks, freeze against, 50-meter penalties. There's so many things that go into it. So, yeah, the more used you are, the more likely you are to have clangers.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know why, but I do have in my head like two images of Goulden, one of him running down a wing and like lacing someone out, and the other one of him just kicking into space. And I guess those kicking into space ones where it ends up going to the opposition could maybe fall into some of these clanger categories pretty easily. Okay, so if you got any other great insights for us, or should we recap and wrap up?
I think that's maybe all that I wrote down. But yeah, I guess just from a summary point of view, like I'm really interested in advancing the amount of data that's available in the fantasy and Supercoach community. Like I need it for myself. Like I do data every single day. I'm an analyst. Like I need this kind of data to create the narrative rather than what I think the community does a lot, where they come up with a narrative in their head. They're just thinking in the car. They come up with a narrative that this is what's going on. This is why this player dropped off. But then they try and find data to use that supports that. And they will find it, because if you go in looking for this data, what you have this idea about in your head, they're kind of going about it the wrong way of saying, like, I've got this narrative and I want data to support it. So they find that. And it turns the community into quite a bit of like an echo chamber of people finding the same things, but it's not actually what's going on. I think a great example is like, I think people have come around to it now, but the fact that Matt Crouch was like affecting the Crows mids in terms of stoppage points, Laird and Dawson both went up. So for Dawson, it was more about his outside ball dropping off, whether that's as the year progresses, he kind of played a lot more mid. He didn't get around the ground as much. And also Miller and Saligo and Hinge had uptick in outside ball. So like people will happily look at the centre bounce usage and the overall scoring, but breaking it down can actually create the story for you. You don't need to come up with the narrative before. You can just look at the data and see if anything's going on. And if it's not, then it's fine. And you can come up with narratives based on the data instead of trying to find data to fit your narrative. So that's what I'm all about. I want to find advanced things so that I can analyze the competition. And I think it's really important for Supercoach because I haven't played it for 15 years. I don't know what's happened in the past. And I need this type of stuff to learn about the game. And it is pretty funny because it doesn't seem like a lot of the community knows very much about Supercoach scoring. So that's why I think it's so valuable just to understand what actually goes into it, and to be able to have an accurate model for that. It's so valuable.
Yeah. No. Yeah, you're spot on. And I must say it's interesting because I come from a strategy background. And so really like the confirmation bias activity that you're talking about is something that we can definitely be guilty of. And I think part of it comes down to whether you get your insights from deductive or inductive reasoning and how you combine like hypothesis and data to get to the right answer. And I think part of the reason why the community, including myself, is guilty of doing exactly what you're talking about, coming up with a hypothesis, seeking out data that confirms whatever that is that you're looking for, is that we haven't had these more advanced statistics to look into, these better measures. And we've been desperately crying out for it for ages. Like, please, champion data, please, Herald's give us some advanced stuff. And it hasn't been there. So you're playing a very valuable role in the community. I can't thank you enough for it, because reading this stuff definitely improves my understanding of the game and gives me more things to think about as the year goes on. So just to recap then, as we've covered, I think a couple of times, there's now this resource on Jaiden's website where you can actually go in and look at what each of the stats are worth in much greater detail and much greater accuracy than we've ever had before, including going into the detail around defensive 50 and forward 50 possessions being worth roughly 20% more than those in the midfield, which is a huge insight and a really big finding, and explains a lot of what goes on, I think, in certain parts of the games. That the official values, of course, that they produce then as a result aren't very useful, and you probably shouldn't be referencing them that often. And then from the fantasy side, really a lot of that insight around stoppage, transition, and CBAs and the relationship between these. So high stoppage players, really high stoppage players, which once again you can find on Jaiden's website, are those that are likely to regress. It's hard to keep up those high stoppage numbers year on year, and probably goes a little bit of a way to explaining why the top priced players on the lines don't tend to repeat, because they are more likely to be up the top of those metrics. And then, there are obviously players that score better or worse with CBAs and have scoring relation to it, but that's not true of everyone. And for transition scoring, a lot of that is not necessarily highly correlated with CBAs. And so for someone like a McRae, where people are saying that his scoring's fallen off just because of CBAs, that's not necessarily true. It can just be because of a decrease in performance, which sounds like it's more the case based on your performance. So something to keep in mind as well. It's not all about the CBAs. You've got to take into consideration other factors. Have I done a good job summarizing? I hope that's like a nod of approval, because definitely in Discord and stuff, I'll like type out something and I'm like, oh, I think Jaiden's saying this. And you're like, nope, you've just stuffed all of that up. So where are we at?
Yeah, that was spot on. And part of the learning for me is also being able to convert data into a narrative, into analytics, and like being able to present it in a way that's easy for people to understand, but not too advanced, so that it doesn't have any value. And that is to do with what I wanted to do with Supercoach as well. I wanted to kind of bridge the gap between the community not knowing how it scored and champion data knowing exactly how it's scored. There needs to be something in the middle that can kind of explain what's going on from both sides. And I don't have any official ties at all, but like I have the skills to be able to collect data, and kind of, I guess with the website, now I'm trying to present it in a way that people can understand and view easily. And it really helps out my own team. So I hope that it helps yours as well.
So I'm going to put you on the spot for the very final question before we log off. Based on the work that you've done and the data and stats you've collected, who are the players, like one maybe from each line, defense, mid, ruck, forward, that have popped out of this as like, I'm much more interested than what I was before?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess in terms of stoppage scoring, I looked into this straight after the season ended. And LDU sitting at 40 points per game, that was like a big green tick for me. I was thinking, hang on, I thought he would have been like completely stoppage and not much around the ground. And North Melbourne weren't great at stoppage last year at all. But if that naturally improves and he's going to be the one to do it, like when I saw that 40 points, I was expecting it to be 50 plus. When I saw that, just absolute lock in the midfield. Yep. For me.
They've had their intra-club this morning, and he was smashing that, as you'd expect, playing against other North Melbourne players. But yeah, definitely one I'm keen on as well.
Yeah, I think in the ruck, I did an analysis from a Supercoach perspective of Gawn with and without Grundy. Now, obviously, the numbers from a Supercoach perspective are massively obvious, but I guess what's actually going on is Gawn gets more hit-outs to advantage in the midfield zone, and he's not Yeah, so exactly here. He got 16 points per game more just from hit outs to advantage in the midfield. Like, that's 4 or 5 per game. That's where his boost came from. Like, that's not anything that he can't do again. Like, he's not taking massive marks all the time and getting cheap handballs or anything. He's hit out to advantage. That's what he is the best in the competition at. So that's very easy to lock him in as well. And I think everyone agrees with that. The only stats he dropped off in was goals and tackles in forward 50, but they don't really matter because he wasn't getting many of those anyway. So that was a massive tick. I think in defense, it is pretty obvious again, but Jaiden Young, he's just got that ability to score as a mid. Compared to someone like Jack Sinclair, where his midfield scoring actually went backwards because he couldn't make up that difference. But Jaiden Young's tackle numbers were really good, so it made up for his long kicking out of D50. And it gives me great confidence to pick him, and I'm sure everyone has him, but that's kind of where I was at with him. And then in the forward line, it's not a lot, but I guess it's really made me reconsider Jack Macrae. So from the start of the year, everyone's picking him. He's such an easy pick. But when I came to my own team and I came to put him in, I was like, do I really want this? Like, I don't know. So I did this massive deep dive into what's going on. And it's just that natural, like, he's been so good for so long. Can he keep doing it? I'm not exactly sure. So I'm pretty keen to have a bit of a play around in the forward line. We play a salary cap game, so spending your money wisely is very important, and I want upside in all my players. If Jack Macrae's stoppages go up, that doesn't mean his transition will. So just little things like that really give me a bit of an idea. I analyze every single player. Like, I want them to be exactly right. So that's where I'm at with my team.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Jaiden. I really appreciate it. I guess over to you to plug all of your stuff, where they can find you, where the people can find you. Otherwise, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. And it's great to be able to talk through this stuff because it's like the off season, it's been very computer based. Like, I just have to keep doing stuff. I spent way too long on it. But yeah, you can find my website. I've just bought a domain name, so it's very easy to remember now. statsbyjaiden.com.au. And I've got some links on there to my socials, but yeah, the main one is Twitter, at Jaiden_Popowski.
It's not Popowski, it's Popowski. Oh man, I've been saying it wrong this whole time. All right,
Popowski. I did actually consider saying Popowski. Hang on, Popowski right then.
Yeah.
I say Popowski. So the W, if everyone wants to say it, just pretend the W doesn't exist. But I'm fine with both because it is tricky.
I'm sure you've been getting it your whole life probably at this point anyway.
Yeah.
Surely I'm not the first.
Yeah. So I know the guys over at the Centre Bounce made a big deal about it to get it right before we started. So but I'm fine with both, so it doesn't really matter.
They're better than I am then. Well, once again, thanks for your time, Jaiden. Appreciate it so much. And to those that listened, I hope you found something useful, something interesting, and please do check out Jaiden's website. There's so much more that can be found there. We barely scratched the surface. There's lots of good content and more to come from what I hear through the preseason as well, which is really exciting. So thanks all, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.